We're just about to get started. Thank you everyone for being here. We're making a few more copies of that handout if you didn't get any. It should be coming right up.
Yeah, I know she was a first grade teacher. She was in Michigan and she would do.
I'll go ahead and start just so that we stay on time, which is one of my big goals for the evening. Thanks everyone for being here, coming out on a Tuesday to learn more about Pine Tree Power ballot question. My name is Marina Mails and I'm the Executive Director of York Ready for Climate Action. York Ready for Climate Action is a grassroots citizens organization here in town. We're dedicated to raising awareness about climate change and advancing environmentally friendly policies and behaviors. And we're working to help the town of York reach its climate goals. If you're interested in more information, you can take a flyer or sign up on this table over there. This election day, November 7th, is coming up soon. Voters will be asked, do you want to create a new power company governed by an elected board to acquire and operate existing for-profit electricity transmission and distribution facilities in Maine? That's what you'll see on the ballot when you go to vote. Maine voters will decide if a new quasi-municipal electric utility can take over Central Maine Power Company, or CMP, and Versant Power to become a regulated utility in the state. If voters approve the ballot measure, the new regulated utility would be called Pine Tree Power. Half of the board of directors for this company would be elected by Maine's voters, and the other half would be appointed by those elected directors. If passed, the effective date of the legislation would be January 1st, 2025. Tonight we'll be hearing from two informed opinions from former public advocate Gordon Weil and state representative Gerry Runte. We're going to explore the potential pros and cons of Pine Tree Power. As you're listening, if you have questions and you'd like to submit a question, I've got little pieces of paper and pens up here. If you can come up and get one, write your question down and put it in the basket. We're not going to have tons of time, maybe 15 minutes at the end for questions, so I'll pick through and read them, and we'll get through as many as we can. Throughout the time that these gentlemen are speaking, I'm going to be interrupting them. I'm going to be saying, your 2 minutes are up. I'm sorry, your 10 minutes are up, because I want to keep our conversation going and on track. And so I apologize in advance for being rude. And I'll take a minute to introduce our speakers. Gerry Runte's 47-year career in the energy industry was equally split between the electric utility and emerging energy technology sectors. Great. There we go. Gerry's utility experience with both investor-owned and consumer-owned utilities included senior management roles in system and strategic planning, new business development, and regulatory affairs. In the emerging energy technology sector, primarily hydrogen and alternative fuels, he created, launched, and managed new organizations and business units, as well as evaluated potential investments on behalf of investors and sought financing for early-stage companies. Gerry holds a bachelor's in math and chemistry and a master's in nuclear engineering from Penn State University. He is now the Democratic representative for Maine House District 146, which includes Western York, Algonquin, and Eastern Wells. He's also a member of the Joint Committee on Energy, the Utilities and Technology Joint Committee, and as well as the Maine Climate Council. Gordon Weil was Maine's first public advocate. He also represented and advised consumer-owned utilities and electricity customers across the US and Canada for almost 50 years. He led the New England negotiations to create the 6-state integrated electric transmission system. He has been an expert witness at federal, state, and provincial regulatory commissions, including in Maine. He was Commissioner of Business Regulation, Director of the Office of Energy Resources, and a Harpswell Selectman, and has been a weekly newspaper columnist since 2008. He has an AB from Bowdoin College and a PhD in public law and government from Columbia University. So each of our speakers is going to have 10 minutes to go over the basics and describe their stance about Pine Tree Power. Gerry, would you like to go first since you brought slides and you've got that queued up? All right.
Doesn't matter.
All right, here's the microphone, and I will be, I'll be telling you when your 10 minutes are up. Thank you.
Seconds before the clock starts.
Okay, fair enough. Yes. And folks, we are recording this, just so you know, it'll be available on the library's website, just for your information. Thank you.
I'm the chair. We want the lights to work.
Wish I had another hand up here. Well, welcome everyone, and thanks for York Ready Climate Action for putting this on. This particular, I'm going to go fairly fast given the time limit. This particular issue on the ballot, as far as I'm concerned, is the most important one. It's a complex topic that demands analytic rigor upon which to base decisions. Unfortunately, analysis hasn't been provided by either side, and we have a voting public that is not equipped to make judgments and discern right from wrong. So what we have is a whole lot of emotional arguments, and hopefully I can shed light. So I want to make 3 main points this evening. Number one.
Can you hold the microphone?
Yep,
Thank
sorry.
you.
3 main points this evening. The ads on the airwaves will seem to say you've got 2 choices: keep the status quo or do Pine Tree Power. And my view is no. A vote no leaves an opportunity to let recent regulatory reforms work and deal with the problem that way. Secondly, the pursuit of Pine Tree Power represents an existential threat to our climate and our grid modernization goals. And the third point is Pine Tree claims sound great, but they really have no analytical foundation, and their foundation is deeply flawed. So let's go through this one by one. With regard to regulation, dissatisfaction with utility performance is warranted. Poor performance is primarily a result of inadequate and antiquated regulation. 18 other states either use or are implementing performance-based rate making, where what utilities earn depends on how they perform according to a set of metrics. We don't have PBR in Maine because of first the LePage administration, and then followed by Pine Tree advocates who rejected it over the last 4 years. The first step of PBR, though, was enacted in Maine early last year over the objections of Pine Tree. It's a critical first step. It's going to take time to take effect, and the legislature needs to strengthen it over time. Many of our climate action goals necessarily involve our electric utilities. If the referendum passes, years of uncertainty regarding the details of who's in charge and what their cost structure is are going to be up in the air. And necessarily, climate and grid initiatives that touch the grid will be put on hold until Pine Tree is fully operational. The takeover of an entire public utility to form a public one has only happened once. It took 13 years. That was the Long Island Power Authority. Boulder, Colorado tried to secede from its utility. After 10 years, it gave up. A tiny little 8-square-mile piece of Florida wanted to secede from their utility. It took them 6 years. Uncertainty also delays grid modernization. Last session, we passed a bill, it was my bill actually, to redesign our future grid. The model takes control of the grid and its planning away from the hands of the utilities, encourages local power, optimizes the system for reliability and cost. Designing this is a pretty complex problem, but you can't even begin unless you have all the specifics of what the utilities are that you're dealing with. So let's test. Country makes two of their primary claims are, if you look at some data on consumer-owned utility, they perform better than investor-owned utility. And ipso facto, if we have a consumer-owned utility at Pine Tree, they will have similar metrics. And the other claim is that Pine Tree will save customers $367 annually for 30 years, starting right away. So let's take a careful look at the analytical integrity of these arguments. First of all, if we were going to start from scratch and create a whole new utility, there's no question that a consumer-owned utility is the right way to go. But we're not doing that. Pine Tree proponents cite data from 2000, primarily small urban municipal utilities. They conspicuously exclude data from rural electric co-ops, which have a lot closer similarities to our utilities than these little municipals. And what we're talking about is combining 21,000 rural square miles, serving 800,000 customers, spread out over 3 different service territories, one of which isn't even connected to the other 2, or the New England grid. Unlike these urban consumer-owned utilities, which establish their own infrastructure from the outset, Pine Tree is going to have to integrate systems developed and overseen by 2 different managements. And additionally, it begins operation with the onus of a massive mortgage and the extra expense of hiring a third-party manager. It would keep the existing union and workforce, implying no labor cost savings. Comparisons with other existing consumer-owned utilities is frankly a false equivalence. And it's kind of like this chart. If you plot the divorce rate in Maine with the capita consumption of margarine, it's a 99% correlation. And that's the kind of comparison that's being made here. But there is one comparison that is very apt, and that is the Long Island Power Authority. It mirrors what Pine Tree pretends to be almost exactly. In 1985, New York State decided to take over the Long Island Lighting Company, an investor-owned utility. It took them 13 years to get LIPA going. LIPA has had 3 different investor-owned utilities as its management. The last one was hired in 2014, and I think is about to get fired. And after 24 years of operation, what do they have? Residential rates are significantly higher than New York and New Jersey. Commercial rates are near the highest in the country, and J.D. Power's rates are right there with CMP. But it's also been endless controversy and turmoil. Commission after commission. Last year, the Long Island Chamber recommended they put LIPA back to an investor-owned utility. A recent restructuring plan was rejected just in the last month. And who knows what happens next. And what you got is 37 years of ratepayer misery. This one, personally, I find really difficult to stomach. People are being told that they will save $367 a year. That's this chart to the left, $9 billion in savings. Divide by 30 years, divide by 100,000 customers. That's where the 367 comes from. The reality is, Pine Tree Power has never done its own economic analysis that was peer-reviewed on the cost and benefits and that treats uncertainty. That number the source of that number is this. 4 years ago, the legislature hired London Economics International to do this analysis. And they came back with a report. It said, you're going to have added costs in the first 10 years and maybe some savings later on. To do that, they created a simulation, a computer simulation model. Pine Tree took London economics model, modified it, put in unrealistic assumptions, and came up with this $9 billion number. LEI and Pine Tree's model is outdated. It hypothesized a future that looks very different than what we would look at today. And all you got to do is look at the bottom left corner of this $9 billion chart, and you can see that you're supposed to get savings starting next year. The fact is that cost savings from cheaper borrowing is overwhelmed by the existing costs Pine Tree assumes, paying for the for-profit company to run it and the mortgage from the buyout. And the likely outcome is cost and a range of costs. And quite frankly, anyone who walks up and says, this specific number is what's going to happen, doesn't really understand what they're talking about. Every single argument, and I'd be glad to go in detail, I don't have the time now, made by our power is similarly afflicted. And it doesn't matter whether they're just misinformed or they're misinformation. It doesn't matter. The question for voters is, would you trust your utility to a group that would make such arguments? Just the market. So to conclude, you could have a consumer-owned utility and you could have local control, but it comes with two conditions. Suspend all grid and climate-related incentives that touch the grid for as long as a decade until it's in place, and expect to pay a premium when it operates. Passing this referendum might be emotionally satisfying in the short term, but it's a disaster for the state in the long term. The regulatory path has a lot of uncertainties, will need further reforms, but it doesn't stall grid and climate initiatives in the meantime. And if it fails, you're no worse off than you are now. If Pine Tree fails, you've lost all that time, and if Pine Tree comes into place, well, welcome to Long Island. So I'm urging everyone to vote no on question 3, give regulation time to work, and let your legislators know that you want to see more regulation and more reforms.
Gerry's using the term our power, which is synonymous with Pine Tree Power for those who might have been confused by that. And Gordon, thank you so much. Are you ready to give us your take?
Thank you. Good evening. I want to thank York Climate Action, the town of York Library for holding this forum and for inviting me. I'm from Harpswell, which it takes great pride in being the 13th oldest town in the state, but I can't tell anybody from York about being an old state in town, in the state of old town in the state of Maine. Needless to say, I disagree with almost everything the previous speaker has said, and I'm not going to stand and rebut it, except for one thing. And there I agree with him, and it applies to both sides. And that is, you can't rely on the numbers. Everything you see by way of numbers coming out are self-serving on both sides. Criticized Pine Tree Power. I didn't even know that number. I have anything to do with the Pine Tree Power campaign, but I can accept what he said. But what the proponent or the opponents of Pine Tree Power are saying is equally dubious. The point here is what we're hearing in this campaign is what's wrong with Pine Tree Power. And the only thing wrong with that is Pine Tree Power doesn't exist. Pine Tree Power is a proposed alternative to what does exist. And it's been proposed because of what's wrong with Central Maine Power and Versant. And there are at least 4 main things, and you'll see it on the sheet that I handed out, and I'm not going to repeat what you can read and take away. But the 4 things that I see are, 1, it costs more. The facilities, the poles, the wires, the meters, everything that's a physical part of the physical plant costs more in any investor-owned utility compared to a consumer-owned utility. And the reason is they pay for what they build 2 ways. 1, they sell shares, so they have to pay dividends to shareholders. They pay about half of the cost. The other half is they borrow the money and they have to pay taxable rates. The lender wants to be able to pay taxes and still walk away with a good payment. Consumer-owned utilities finance entirely by tax-exempt debt. And therefore, their interest rates are lower. The lender to the utility doesn't have to pay taxes on the interest received. The net result is consumer-owned utilities are generically less costly. Secondly, their rates are lower. Consumer-owned utilities have lower rates than investor-owned utilities across the country, in general, everywhere, big, small. Oh, we should compare them with co-ops. Look at the letters EMEC. That's the Eastern Maine Electric Co-op. It has about 12,000 customers in a service territory about the size of Connecticut and Rhode Island put together. And look at its wires costs. And that's what these utilities charge. The power supply comes from a competitive market. All these utilities are our wires companies. And look at its wires cost for a very spread out area, much more spread out than either Versant or CMP. Reliability. Well, this you've heard, and this is a federal number from the US Department of Energy Information Administration. The utilities in Maine are usually ranked 49th or 50th in reliability in the country. Now, it happens that the one that's right up near the top is Nebraska. And Nebraska is the only state that's 100% public power, has no investor-owned utilities. But we're told, yeah, that's because they don't have any trees in Nebraska. We have trees here. Central Maine Power was founded in 1910. The first time they had a program to deal with trees was in 2008. Now, there were trees around for a long time. And so they kind of lost the excuse. They just didn't do anything about it because you could get the ratepayer to pay to trim the trees, and then you could take that money, not trim the trees, and that added onto your profit. That's exactly what happened. So it's an unreliable system. And finally, it's cheap. It's cheap. $13.5 billion is cheap. No, $13.5 billion is pure fiction. It's cheap because what you're buying is the facilities, the hardware from the existing utilities. And they have to tell the regulators every year what those facilities are worth. And the latest number is between the two utilities, they're worth $5.4 billion. And you know who's paying for them now? We are. They're in our rates now. They're not going to be something new we have to pay for. They're something we're already paying for. But the sellers deserve a premium. Their ratepayer, their investors counted on making some money, and now you're going to take that away from them. So let's give them more than just what they should get to pay for the facilities. Well, we have Versant. That's one of the biggies. It just acquired that utility from Emera, another utility. And what did it pay by way of a premium? 25%. Not anything more than the cost of the facilities plus 25% premium because that's what the seller got as a reward. Well, if you take the 5.4 million and you add to it 25%, you get a total of $6.75 billion, of which 5.4 we're already paying. So all we're paying is, we would pay is $1.35 billion, 1/10 of what CMP says. And when you look at the other savings I've talked about, that takes care of that additional cost because you finance that over 30 years, $1.35 billion. It's curious to note that if you take the total cost of buying the utility $6.75 billion. That's exactly 50% of 13.5. And that's exactly what CMP's consultant did. It doubled the number. And it did it so anybody can see it. It's public information that that's what they do. So all in all, what's good about Pine Tree Power is it isn't the existing guys who are too expensive, too unreliable, and too unresponsive. Now we'll get to other questions like environment and so on, which are important questions to discuss. But the fact is that what Pine Tree Power does, this vote does, is start a process. The utility doesn't come out of the ground the day after election day. It takes time. The board has to be elected. They're not all politicians. You know, Kennebunk, it's not that far away. They have a public power entity called the Kennebunk Light and Power District. You may know something about their elections. They look heavily political to you. I don't think so. It's about local people taking an interest in doing something for their neighbors. And that's how public power works. We have very successful public power in this state. And if you think it can't be done on a big scale, the largest public power entity, bigger than the state of Maine, is the city of Los Angeles. So there's public power of all sizes. It can be done. It is done. It works, and the rates are lower. It seems to me lower rates and better reliability, pretty much the case is made. I thank you and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you. A reminder that if you have questions, we have paper up here and we also have a very packed house. So if you wouldn't mind just taking it and take a pen, pass around. We will do our best to get your questions and have them make it back up here to the basket. Whoops. I'm going to start out though with some questions of my own. And the first one, as Executive Director of York Ready for Climate Action, that I want to ask about are what the implications are for clean energy in the state of Maine. Which one of these plans would help us get an updated grid and a green energy supply more rapidly? And I know you touched on this a little bit, Gerry, but I'll ask again just to reiterate that point. And Gordon, would you mind answering first? All right. Take about 2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes.
Right. Neither of them. These are wires companies. These are not the power supply. These are not the people producing the electricity. This is just the bus that the passenger gets on. Who the passenger is depends on somebody else. Central Maine Power and Versant have no program whatsoever that hasn't been imposed upon it by the regulator and the legislator. And the same thing would be true now for Pine Tree Power. And the question is, yeah, but it's going to take years for Pine Tree Power to get in place. Yeah, it will, because they're going to litigate the living daylights out of it. And it'll take that long to get through the process. And so you'll have to live with that happening. But meanwhile, there'll only be one franchised utility to do the job for the service area, and it will have to do what public policy says it has to do for the environment. And it ought to. Now, I would think an elected board compared to utilities headquartered in Bilbao, Spain, and Calgary, Alberta, is more likely to be responsive to what people in Maine would like to have, but that's just a guess.
Thank you, Gerry.
Yeah, the key to more clean energy is how one interconnects it with the grid. And right now we have a huge problem because there's a big backlog of interconnecting. And the reason we have that illustrates one of the issues with Pine Tree Power. We have this because a lot of people got very enthused about encouraging an enormous amount of solar coming into Maine. But apparently nobody said, well, how much can this grid really take? And as having worked in a utility and know how systems work, you can look at a system and you can say, well, we could probably put some here and probably put some here. without having to put new wires in and new investments to bring that in, because remember, this grid was made to be one way. From a big power plant to transmission to distribution to end users. It was never designed to be a two-way grid with distributed power out at the edges. And so figuring out how to do that properly without messing up the reliability of the rest of the system is no trivial task. And that task would fall on Pine Tree Power just as well as it is falling right now on CMP and Versant. And in fact, one of the things that I was talking about in the grid modernization is the whole point of that is to start making this grid a multi-directional grid. And make the investments that do that, and then put the planning, the integrated distribution system planning that does exactly that forward look. Where can we best put distributed power? In the hands of a separate entity that's out of the control of the utilities. So, this is not a simple topic, and it's not easily glazed. I mean, you can come up with simplistic statements about it, but intent really doesn't enter into it. It's the mechanics and the engineering that are associated with how you bring in that clean energy into a system. I mean, Gordon is right. They're wires companies. They don't have anything to do with supply, but they have to connect them. Thanks.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I'm also wondering what the social justice implications of Pine Tree Power are. For example, does one plan better serve low-income, vulnerable populations? Would you mind answering first?
No, I don't think it makes a lot of difference. I mean, we have multiple programs that affect both consumer-owned utilities and investor-owned utilities. Things like LIHEAP and low-income programs are the kind of things that are in the purview of the legislature. And so the legislature can be the impetus for federal finding appropriate external funding. I mean, there's federal funding available from time to time. There's a whole lot available right now. They and the state government and Efficiency Maine are in the best position to figure out what the best way to deploy this is and how to get best help to the people that need it. The utilities just, whether it's Pine Tree, CMP, or Versant, they just do what they're told.
Thanks. How about you?
That's not exactly right. It's more or less right. That is to say, a lot of the low income programs, and this is what we're talking about, are required now. I was glad to say that I was instrumental in making sure this was a statewide thing so that when you pay for low income assistance in your electric rates, it goes to not, if you're living in Cape Elizabeth, it doesn't go to Cape Elizabeth, it goes to Van Buren. And that works better because that's where the people who need it are. But beyond that, we have some history. Right now, people have problems paying their electric rate in utilities. Some people in every utility has trouble paying their electric rate. And it's up to the utility to try to deal with that problem. And one way is disconnect them. If they don't pay their bills, cut them off. And so we've had to have pretty strict regulation to prevent the investor-owned utilities from cutting people off. The consumer-owned utilities, who are after all owned by their customers, have proven to be much more sensitive to the problems of low-income people. And you can see it in the disconnect rates. It is that people are not being cut off, they're being helped, and help is directed to them. There's a lot of talk about this being an elected board, but an elected board means something. They're going to be asked, the candidates to be on the board of Pine Tree Power, are going to be asked about what they're going to do, and they're going to be accountable for what they do. And I've seen elections where board members in consumer-owned utilities lost because they were held accountable. That doesn't happen to foreign-owned utilities. And so the net result is that sensitivity to the problems of Maine people being decided by elected Maine people is likely to do more for low-income customers.
Thanks, Gordon. I'm gonna direct the next question at you, so I was gonna say, don't sit down. We've been over this some and we've heard it some, but I'm wondering if we could just circle back around and talk again about the impact for ratepayers. You could say a few more words about that.
Well, I think it's important, and if you look at that sheet, to understand, actually, there are two things going on. Your electric bill is composed of two elements. One of them is the wire charge, which is what it costs, in this case, CMP, to pay CMP for its holes in wires and other facilities, meters and so on. All of that is paid for, including an element of profit to the shareholders. Nothing wrong with that. I'm definitely not against profit. I had a business, so I have experience struggling to make it. But I think that that runs up the cost. And that runs up the cost for the customer. It's just built in the structure of the utility. And that's okay. In a competitive world, you're gonna have people with different costs, and you're gonna select according to your own interest, according to one of the factors will be, does it cost more, does it cost less? This is a monopoly. There are no two power companies to choose between, so you're required to pay them a profit. And if you see on this sheet, it says 9.5%. If any of you are getting 9.5% at your bank, can you tell me what bank that is? And that's an approved rate by the regulator. When the rate is set, the Maine Public Utilities Commission says you may earn 9.5%. That's a pretty good deal. And so that's why there's a difference, why it's going to be more expensive. But just look for 1 second at the second column, which they have nothing to do with. The utilities don't have anything to do with that, but if you look at the cost of power, which is, any of us can buy our own power supply. The consumer-owned utilities do it better than the Public Utilities Commission, which does it for the big utilities. They do it better because they only have one interest in mind, the interest of their customers. And you'll see the power rate, which they purchase for their customers, beats the power rate that the PUC purchases for CMP and Versant.
Thank you. The impact on ratepayers.
Okay. That's all well and good, but we're not talking about existing costs. What we're talking about is, what are the costs going to be going forward? And you can do a simple thought experiment when you have, on the one hand, that whatever the number is, $4, $5, $6 million, $1 billion of the rate base that's a part of your rates today. So that continues because Pine Tree Power buys it. Pine Tree Power takes over all of CMP and Versant's debt. Pine Tree Power pays an extra cost for this O&M provider. They have to go out and hire a utility to run their utility. They've said as much, and they've made that clear. They've said they're going to forego being exempt from property taxes, so that continues. They've told the labor union that nothing's going to change. So you've got all these fundamental basic things that are in the rates now, except for the profit piece. And you know what that gets replaced by? It gets replaced by the mortgage and some of these other costs. And when you just think through the possibility, and we're talking about ranges here of possibilities, there's no single number, there's no cents per kilowatt hour with 3 significant figures. We're talking about ranges of possibilities because there's a lot of unknowns in how you do this. The net result is you cannot conclude that customers end up being more expensive for customers than where they are now. And where they are now is still subject to lots more regulation where there's an opportunity to reduce that.
Thank you. Starting to get warm, right? Great. We have a basket here full of really wonderful questions, so I'll start with them and we'll see if we can get through them all. I'm not sure. First question, what assures us that Pine Tree will pay no more than 6.5 billion and a fixed 5% cost?
Nothing. This is gonna be litigated. There's no question about it. The law itself that is going to be voted on provides for litigation. Determines the court that will make the decision. It would be great if Pine Tree Power and CMP could sit down and just negotiate a deal. That's not gonna happen. CMP is gonna fight this till the very end, to the last possible minute, which means it's gonna be litigated. I don't know what the price will be, but I know what the price has been here and elsewhere. You pay for the value of the facilities, the net book value is called, and that is what you're now paying, plus a premium. So the issue gets to be, what's the premium? What is the investor entitled to as compensation for the being taken out of ownership? And that's, it's not written in stone anywhere. That's litigated. And people listen to both sides, but the Maine has a recent precedent, and that is the purchase by Versant of its facilities in what used to be Bangor Hydro and Maine Public Service territories in the northern and eastern part of the state. And there they paid a premium of 21% by my calculation, but let's say 25%. And that, if you add the two together, gives you that number. Is it guaranteed? Absolutely not. We have to see what came out of litigation unless CMP and Versant were willing to negotiate.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. The purchase of Versant was a tiny little piece of territory. It might be roughly 20% of the combined, and it's all rural. It's like, I don't know, 50,000 customers out of 800,000 when you put it all together. A much more comparable purchase that happened much more recently was the acquisition by PP&L of Rhode Island Electric, and their multiple was 1.9. And if you look at the averages of some of the acquisitions that have happened lately, they're more than 2. Pine Tree loves to bring up Winter Park, Florida, which I mentioned, seceded itself, took itself out of its big utility. It paid a multiple of 5.5. Now, I'm not suggesting 5.5 is the number, but this number is a very broad range, but the likelihood of its number being 1.25, frankly, is quite low. I think it's not fair to call it a premium. What you're paying is market value. You know, just like your house, you bought your house for X price. And if it's worth today twice what you bought it for, that's a multiple of 2. Well, it's the same concept here. So what is the market value of all those assets? Surely they've appreciated over time. Think of market values on property. It is an unknown, but it isn't a trivial number.
Thank you. Another question. Other utilities like Pine Tree have price gouged during weather extremes like Texas in the last couple of years. What would prevent Pine Tree from doing this? You want to take it again?
Yeah.
Going back and forth.
I don't know really what's getting discussed there. I mean, the problem with ERCOT and price gouging had everything to do with the cost of the electricity, not the wires connection. They had major problems with all of the natural gas units in their network. ERCOT is the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. It's more or less its own little entity. It doesn't connect, and so it can't bring in power from the outside, but it's short. And so this was all a supply issue, and neither CMP nor Versant nor Pine Tree Power had anything to do with supply.
Thanks. Do you have anything to add there?
I'm not sure I understood the question, but I understood the answer and I agree with it. That is to say, the cost of the power that is being transferred over the wires, over the system, is not a matter for our utilities in this state. At the end of last century, we decided that the utilities would not be involved in power, but only in wires. And so the cost of the electricity on the line, the energy cost, not the wires cost, is not determined by the utilities and is a function of what's going on in the market. The one interesting thing is, we're not gonna get power from California. No matter who's selling you power, it's gonna come from approximately the same generators, and they're likely to be located either in New England, New York, or New Brunswick. That's it, or Quebec. That's it. So it's a finite pool, we know what it is, and it's sensitive to whatever the cost of the generator.
Thank you. Gordon, this question may be for you. I don't know, Gerry, if you know this, but what are the education or work requirements for people who might be elected or appointed to be on the board of Country Power?
There are two groups, and I have to correct slightly what you said, they're not equal in size. 7 elected members have no particular qualifications any more than you have to have qualifications to make all the rest of the laws in the state in the legislature. He didn't have to pass any tests, he just had to get your vote, which I'm glad he did. And the same thing will be true for the 7 members who are elected to the board. They will represent their constituency, and their credential will be that they were able to convince people that they were going to run the utility in their interest. There will then be 6 other members of the board where there are qualifications in the legislation, and the purpose of having that is to ensure that on the board you do have experts, you do have people with background in the field, in various aspects of the field, but not enough to control it, but enough to have a great deal of weight in the determination. Essentially, all the experts plus 1 of the 7 constitute a majority. So it's a pretty good way to balance this. I don't agree with everything in the bill. A lot of things that were mentioned as being defects of the bill, I agree are defects of the bill. But I do think in this case, this was a very good way to deal with the question of how you combine the public interest with a certain level of expertise. These people will set the policy. The people who are hired to climb the poles and make sure the system operates will not set the policy. They will just do the work. And I noticed in the paper today, somebody said, oh, I never heard this happening. I had it happen in a utility in Vermont that I had in Norwich, Vermont, where the military academy is located. That system was run in terms of people climbing up and down the poles by Central Vermont Public Service and investor-owned utility. But the policy was set by the elected board of Northfield.
Thank you. Do you want to add anything there?
Just something real quickly, and I'm not suggesting that things would go necessarily awry, but be very cautious of boards. I mean, we had 8 years of the LePage administration. They controlled the PUC, and they played a significant role in the fact that a lot of the regulation that these 2 utilities are under never really got brought up to 21st century standards.
Thank you. You 2 are doing great under the pressure of these popcorn questions. Thank you. And I have another. CMP for years has stood in the way of development of solar in the state. Why should I feel this attitude by CMP would change? Did you want to take that first?
Sure. I think initially probably CMP did, but a major change was made in the rate system. You know, their part of what they earned depended on your wires charge, depended on how much throughput came through. So if there was less throughput at solar, they would get less money. That changed. And so now that's been disconnected from throughput. So they no longer have any financial incentive to avoid putting solar on. The lingering and ongoing and quite difficult problem is what I mentioned earlier, this the kind of planning and research that needs to be done to decide when and where where the right locations are for power coming into this grid, whether or not you need to put new wires out in order to accommodate it, and what's the plan overall long-term. Part of that bill that introduced performance-based rates, another element of it required that the utilities begin to file what's called integrated distribution system plans. They had never been required to do this before. And these are forward-looking, 3 years out, looking, okay, well, where can we add new power onto this network? And if we're going to get the kind of numbers coming in, how much investment is necessary to bolster the wires if that's the best solution? It hadn't been done in the past, it's just beginning to start now.
They didn't do it because they don't make as much money doing it. You've heard of NECEC, this new transmission line that's being built to Massachusetts across the state of Maine. That's a federally regulated line, not a state regulated line. And federal regulation doesn't give you 9.5%. That's not enough of an encouragement. They give you 11.5%. So I'm in the business of running utility, and I have a choice between building big transmission lines where my profit is much higher, or regular lines in the state of Maine where my profit isn't quite so high. So if I deal with helping local solar get connected or become involved, I don't make any kind of money like I do if I get into a big transmission line. And one of the biggest pieces of baloney that CMP dishes out is we only pay 7% of that. All the rates and the rest of, all the ratepayers and the rest of New England pay the rest of it. Yeah, we pay 7% of theirs too. So when they build a transmission line between Connecticut and Massachusetts, we pay for that. So it's not a bargain. But CMP will tell you that it is. So the simple answer is, there's no economic incentive for them to be doing what promotes necessarily local distributed generation, which doesn't involve big transmission lines or solar or wind. Unless you can build a new transmission line, it's not interesting to them. And as a result, there's a difference between a company that's just in business to make money, and by law, the fiduciary responsibility of investor-owned utilities is not to their customers, it is only to their shareholders. As far as their customers are concerned, it's a question of what the PUC makes them do. Where in a consumer-owned utility, they have nobody else to be responsible to except their customers. And so they have no particular motivation to just drive up rates to make more money.
I'll ask you another question while you're standing here. This one's for you. Why would consumer-owned power be more reliable?
Because it is. I mean, the history is, you don't want to talk about Nebraska because they don't have trees. You'll notice on a piece of paper, I put the second most treed covered state in the union. Happens to be a state you're familiar with called New Hampshire. Look at their outage rate compared to Maine. The fact is that, as I indicated, you can boost your profits if you don't invest in taking care of what's called vegetation management. And the history in this state, and we're talking about this state, we're not talking about a nuclear power plant on Long Island, which was the issue there and not the issue here. In this state, they didn't tend to their knitting. Now, I was public advocate and head of the state energy office a long time ago. And when I was there, I advocated that the utilities ought to be using something called tree wire. If you look on a lot of the utility poles, you'll notice a bare wire at the top level, a thin bare wire. That's mostly how you get your electricity. And a tree falls on that line, it breaks, and you have an outage. Tree wire is insulated and around a metal line, a metal cord that holds it. The tree falls, the line doesn't break. Does it cost more? Yes, it costs more, but you don't have to pay to fix it every time there's a storm. These outages that occur all the time are because we don't use tree wire. And CMP has just now, within the last year, begun to start to install tree wire when I suggested it to them in about 1980.
Thank you, Gordon. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, let's talk about reliability. The Eastern Maine Electric Cooperative, the biggest consumer-owned utility in Maine, has worse reliability rating than CMP. And they have had worse ratings for years. You can look up the data, it's right on the Department of Energy website. With regard to Nebraska, let's talk about Nebraska as the paragon of consumer power. 100 years ago, there were 142 little municipal utilities and 40 investor-owned utilities in Nebraska, and tons of farmers who had no electricity. So they consolidated all that stuff and did rural electrification from scratch. So that's the basis for why Nebraska has so much. It's got cheap rates because it has an extraordinary amount of coal power that it uses. It's the 9th worst carbon content of electricity in the United States. And with regard to this tree coverage thing, it's no laughing matter. I have a graph I'd be glad to show you that plots on the one hand reliability and on the other hand tree coverage, and it's an upward line, and you can see where all the states fall on it, and it almost follows exactly with, Nebraska is down here at being the second least forested in Maine, and EMEC, the Eastern Maine Electric Cooperative, is at the far right end of the scale.
Thanks. I think we probably have time for about 2 more questions. This one is getting at the sort of cost savings that may trickle down to consumers or not. What is the projected percentage basis points gained by replacing the existing long-term debt with public bonds? What does that difference mean for the annual cost savings? Cost taking into account cost of debt restructuring.
Well, again, I have a sheet I can show you on my computer, but I actually did that calculation. And the cost savings is the differential in borrowing between the consumer-owned and the investor-owned. Corporate rates are right around 5.6%. The municipals would be in the low 4s. So if you use a 1.9% rate differential, and you assume going forward, over the next 30 years, you spend $15 billion on new infrastructure. What you save is $2 billion. Now, on the other side of the ledger, if you use a 1.5 multiple on a book price of $6 billion, the number comes out to be $4 billion in added costs. And if you have the more realistic number, which is twice book value, you end up with an additional cost of over $6 billion. So this notion that savings, I mean, you just gotta run the numbers, and it's simple formulas in Excel. You gotta pick some assumptions, what that $15 billion investment is in future infrastructure. It's probably plus or minus 50% in terms of how wide a range it could be. But that's the reality of the situation.
You want to comment on that?
What's been engaged in now is exactly throwing numbers around, which I thought we had both renounced. And I'm not going to get into that, but I am going to get into a couple of things that said earlier. Nebraska, Maine, they have a lot of coal. What's coal? Coal's a fuel. We're talking about wires company. Compare the Nebraska wires cost with the Maine wires cost. Leave out the coal's effect on rate, and Nebraska is a lot cheaper than Maine. And that's, bringing up coal is what I would call a red herring. The other is Eastern Maine is unreliable. Jackman is pretty unreliable. Oh, Flagstaff Lake area, totally unreliable. All of that. Of course, when you have very low density, you have more lines that are out in the open space. And per customer, they're less reliable. There's no question about it. And Eastern Maine is less reliable than Central Maine Power, but Eastern Maine doesn't have York, doesn't have Portland, doesn't have Lewiston, doesn't have Augusta, doesn't have these cities. The reliability of Eastern Maine should be compared with the reliability of the rural sections of Central Maine Power. So the fact is, bringing Eastern Maine in, and for its reliability is, I think, another red herring. But the fact is, what the impact in rates, there was one thing that was said that's not right. You're not comparing the cost of interest of a consumer-owned utility with the cost of interest of an investor-owned utility. That's only half of the story for the investor-owned utility. You're comparing the cost of interest for a consumer-owned utility for, whatever he wants to say, 4.5%, with what the investor is getting. That's half of the cost. And the investor is getting 9.5%. That's a big difference. That's not 1%. That's a lot of percent. That's a lot of money. And that's the difference. In a consumer-owned utility, it's not an investor-owned utility. You're getting rid of the investor and the reward that must be paid to the investor. And that's where the saving is, not simply between the tax exempt and taxable interest rates, which covers half of the IOU's cost, but the other half, which is the return on equity.
Thank you, Gordon. Would each of you take maybe 1 minute to give your last parting words and to thank people for coming out? Would that be fine? Would you mind going first? All right.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. There was a lot of stuff discussed here tonight. There's a lot of uncertainty in how either of these paths might go forward. On the one hand, the regulatory path that I mentioned, and on the other hand, the Pine Tree Power path. And what I'm urging everyone to consider is that the regulatory path has the benefit of not messing up all of the terrific progress that Maine has made in achieving its climate goals and the future potential for grid modernization and doing things like this is the 21st century.
Yes, Gordon?
Thank you. I've enjoyed very much discussing this with you, debating this with you. Thank you very much for listening to all of this and taking it in. I'm not going to ask you how to vote or tell you who I think I think you ought to vote. I'm going to tell you how I'm going to vote, and I'm going to vote for Pine Tree Power. And I know something about this business. I've been involved in the regulatory and the customer side of the electric utility business for a long time. And I think this can be made to work. I will agree. There are uncertainties about everything in the future. I think all of us have come to understand, well, didn't know COVID was coming, that life is full of uncertainties. And so that's true. We don't know with certainty what will happen, but we do know the likelihood of things based upon experience and knowledge about what's happening, not what people in campaigns on both sides are saying, are claiming, are asserting. We know the facts. We know something about rates. We know something about how these utilities work. And so I recommend, and I think you're doing it, by being here, that you look into this, you consider this, and you talk about this with other people in the community before you vote. I think this is an important vote. This can change our lives somewhat, if we do the right thing. And so I urge you to give this very careful consideration and make a careful and informed decision and get other people out there to do the same. Thank you.
Okay, everyone, wonderful evening, take care, thanks for coming up.
Thank you, Marina.